Gadmir, Tensor, Terrin, Dant, Guten, Perne, Kohun, Han.
Thank you very much, Ms. Chitjian. This attendance is really overwhelming. I was expecting no more than 8 or 10 people. Is this an indication of the growing interest in things Armenian, the Armenians, the Armenian cause? If so, that would be overwhelming. In any event, I'm really delighted to see so many of you teachers. I understand there are some principals.
Right.
Who, within the larger framework of developing an interest in what is generally referred to in this country as ethnic studies, has also shown some interest in one of the ethnic groups, namely the Armenians. And this brings me to the question as to what do we mean by ethnic? What do we mean by minorities? When I first came to the United States in 1949 as a graduate student, I thought every single ethnic national group was a minority. In recent years we've discovered that we're no longer minorities. We're part of the majority, and the minorities are only the Chicanos, the blacks, Puerto Ricans, and whatnot, which is a total distortion, I think, of what is meant by minorities, what is meant by ethnics and the like. I'd like to suggest that the Armenians don't consider themselves as an ethnic group in the sense that the term is being currently used. They like to consider themselves a nation. And they are a nation. They don't consider themselves as a race, because that has different connotations, and it's one that is extremely difficult to define. The Armenians consider themselves, as I said, a nation with a very long cultural, historical, literary tradition. I use the term culture in the broadest sense possible. The topic that was chosen for today's presentation is the Armenian language. And I can't help but recall that some 8-10 years ago, at a conference of the anthropologists in the United States, I believe, which was held in Chicago at the university there, the internationally recognized Dr. Margaret Mead and a colleague of hers presented a paper in which they suggested, for a number of reasons, which I shan't go into, that it would be extremely desirable to adopt Armenian as the international language. With that in mind, I have no doubt that you being here today are on the ground floor. You're on the right track. Who knows, someday Armenian might be adopted as the international language. I say that with a big grain of salt. When we talk about the Armenian language, in my paper will deal with the historical development of the language. We're talking about a very ancient civilization, a very ancient nation, whose history goes back at least to the middle of the first millennium BC as far as recorded history is concerned, but its antecedents go way, way back, and it's very difficult to determine exactly when. So we're talking about a tradition, linguistic, cultural, that is at least 2.5 millennia, and considerably a longer period of time. And since language is a living organism, it is born at a given time in history. It develops under all kinds of influences, and if the nation that has used that language as a means of communication in the broadest sense, then, and if there are survivors, there are speakers of that particular language, then you're covering a large number of centuries as the background of its historical development. And that is what I'm proposing to do this afternoon. By way of introduction, I ought to mention parenthetically that the Armenian language as a medium of writing, as a medium of literature, was first recorded at the very beginning of the 5th century A.D. But obviously the language existed considerably longer than that in history. What the Armenians employed in terms of an alphabet, a system of writing, and whether any record of this has been preserved is an extremely interesting and also, unfortunately, a moot question, because there are no records at all as to what means the Armenians or the speakers of Armenian are employed to write. What kind of information does each entry involve? So it gave the declension, if it was a noun or any other part of speech that is declined, or the conjugation, if it's a verb, and it also provided, at the beginning, the meaning of the word, and gave examples of the use of that particular word in sentences. Secondly, Ajarian proceeds, in each case, to give the etymology or brief history of the word, which, in his opinion, was the correct explanation, or as devised by other linguists that preceded him, or he offered his own explanation, or put it somewhat differently again, his own theory or view as to the origin and historical development of the word. And then thirdly, he gives the history of the word as it developed, suggested by other authors or linguists, and which he did not accept. He gives his own history, etymology of the word. He gives examples of its usage, and then he goes on to say that, look, there were so-and-so, these grammarians, linguists, scholars, who have in their works referred to this particular word. They have given us the etymology or history of the word, but I don't accept them, they're wrong. And he proceeds to say why, in his view, they're wrong. And finally, since any given word which is part of the vocabulary of the Armenian language is listed in the book, the derivative forms are not given. That is, words that are formed on the basis of a basic word are not given because they are derived from a basic root. However, he felt it was important for him to indicate the root forms as they occur or occurred historically in a number of spoken and not written dialects of the Armenian language. Now, there are, as I said, some 10,000 entries in the 7-volume dictionary. Ajarian has provided for the first time his own etymologies of over 1,600 words. I might also add that there are a considerable number of root forms, basic forms of Armenian words in his dictionary that have no explanation at all. Namely, there is in effect a blank. He says, this is a word, I cannot figure out its origin. I cannot tell you on the basis of my own investigations what other word in what other language it might be related to. I suspect very strongly that these are words that might, to a considerable extent, I suppose, be etymologically explained as linguists are able to decipher inscriptions, which usually are cuneiform tablets of languages about which they know very little at the present time. This would, I think, support my own contention that many of the words whose origins have not been explained actually go back to languages that preceded the formation of the Armenian language and which came into the Armenian vocabulary as a result of the assimilation of the speakers of Armenian with native peoples in their subsequent historic homeland who had preceded them there or who happened to be there. We know historically that the ancestors of the Armenians, when they eventually, well, this was a period when people were migrating from one part of the globe to another and pushing people around and taking over their places. Eventually, when the ancestors of the Armenians arrived at the location which subsequently came to be known as historic Armenia, there were at least 20 different distinct languages spoken in the area, which they eventually overtook and made it their own country. And we must also assume that when you conquer a country where people speaking so many different languages are involved, eventually in the process of assimilating those people and imposing your own language upon speakers of other languages, in the process you also borrow all kinds of vocabulary, terminology, lexical forms from the people whom you're subjugating. Now, going back to Ajarian's dictionary, there's no question in my mind that this is a most unique work. It's considered not only a milestone in the study of the Armenian language, but it also unique in the sense that, to the best of my knowledge, no language, including English, I'm sorry to say, does have a complete etymological dictionary as such. I mean, as monumental as Ajarian's etymological dictionary of Armenian is. Now, Ajarian is also the author of a 2-volume work which is known as the History of the Armenian Language. This is a book which is extremely difficult to find. I'm one of the lucky people who has not only one set but 2 sets of it. Don't tell anybody. I gave the second set to the UCLA library, I think. Now, these 2 volumes were published the first one in 1940 and the second one in 1951. Briefly, this two-volume work is devoted to a detailed historical and descriptive analysis of the origins and also the development of the Armenian language, and particularly devoted to the impact of individual foreign languages upon the integral part of the Armenian vocabulary. I also referred to the cultural relationship between the Armenians and the Persians. Now we know that as I mentioned a moment ago, these relations lasted for some 1600 years, specifically from the 7th century BC until the 11th century AD. This is not to suggest that after the 11th century there were no contacts between the two, but the influence of the Persian language on Armenian became almost negligible after the 11th century for a number of, essentially for political reasons. Now, because of this very close political and cultural relationship between the Armenians and the Persians, the Armenian language was greatly influenced by the Persian, so much so that until late in the 19th century, European linguists were convinced that Armenian must have been one of the dialects of the Iranian language. Now, I must give you some explanation as to why there was this misconception. In Europe, in the 19th century, when there was a greater interest in the study of non-European languages, practically all the linguists who were interested in Near Eastern languages, Oriental languages, had no knowledge of Armenian to begin with, and secondly, those interested in Near Eastern languages are primarily interested in Persian. And any linguist who was knowledgeable in Persian and made his first acquaintance with the Armenian language, every so often he would see an Armenian word which he knew from Persian. And there were so many such words that he finally assumed that, well, Armenian must be a secondary language, must be a dialect of Persian. And this theory prevailed until late in the 19th century, when the very famous German linguist by the name of Heinrich Hufschmann made a much more detailed study of the Armenian vocabulary, compared it with the Persian vocabulary, and came to the conclusion that although they belong to the same family of languages, that is Indo-European languages, the Armenian is a language distinct from Persian and not a dialect of Persian. So the Armenian language since that time has been known as a distinct language, an important member, so to speak, of the family of Indo-European languages, with very close ties to the Persian language. Now, the relationship between Armenian and Persian languages is a very interesting one, insofar as the vocabulary in both languages is concerned. It falls under four what might be called distinct categories. Number one, words that Armenian and Persian have in common, but they're not borrowed one from the other. Rather, they go back to what must have been the original language before the so-called Indo-European speakers of Indo-European, the original language, separated into all parts of Europe and the Near East. Generally, this is referred to as Proto-Indo-European. That is, you have all these Indo-European languages, most of the languages of Europe. It's called Indo-European because it was established quite some time ago that there was a relationship between a significant number of European languages with a number of the languages used in India. That is why it's called Indo-European. Essentially, the relationship being between certain European languages and the language called Sanskrit in India. So you have a basic number of words that have occurred or have been part of the Persian and Armenian vocabulary. They did not borrow it from one another, but they both go to a common origin, which is Proto-Indo-European. The second group consists of words that Armenian has definitely borrowed directly from Persian. The third, words that both Armenian and Persian have borrowed from a third source, mainly from Arabic. And the fourth group consists of words that Persian, for a change, has borrowed from the Armenian language. Now, Ajarian points out that during their 16 centuries of political and cultural association, the Armenian language borrowed a total of a little over 1,400 words from the Iranian languages. When I say Iranian languages, we're talking about the various dialects that were used or spoken in roughly what is today called Iran, or historically also Persia, through its various stages, because Persian has developed from an original base to into modern Persian. Interestingly enough, not only in terms of vocabulary, but also in terms of style, idioms, various uses of the same words, and to some degree syntax peculiar to the Iranian languages had some influence of those areas in the development of the Armenian language. Next, we come to the influence of Greek upon Armenian, which began in the 5th century AD and lasted until the 12th century. Now, during this period, numerous Greek writings were rendered into Armenian, and Ajarian has determined that a total of 916 words came into Armenian from Greek, and that only 164 of these words are still used in the modern literary language. Next, although we know that 138 Hebrew words came into Armenian principally through the translation of the Old Testament via the Greek version and other literary works, only 6 of the total number of 138 Hebrew words have become an integral part of the Armenian lexicon. For instance, I can offhand recall 2 of the words. The Hebrew word for Saturday is Shabbat. They say Shabbat Shalom. The Armenian word for Saturday is Shabbat. The Hebrew word for a shop or a store is Chanut, and the same word occurs in Armenian. Chanut means a store, a shop. And there are 4 others that I don't recall offhand. Now, the Arabs occupied Armenia, as they occupied practically all of the Near East at one time or another. and the Arab occupation of Armenia lasted for about 2 centuries, roughly from the middle of the 7th century until the middle of the 9th century. One of the strangest phenomena is that although the Arabs were in occupation of Armenia for roughly 2 centuries, no Arabic word ever came into the Armenian literary vocabulary. And this is extremely difficult to explain. However, Arabic had some influence on the development of the Armenian vocabulary in the 11th and 12th centuries, mainly as a result of the translations of Arabic scientific writings, particularly medical and botanical, into the Armenian language. A gentleman in Los Angeles, an Armenian family from Iran, has a manuscript which was written in 1298 for a reigning king. It deals with horse breeding. It's something like an encyclopedia on horses, diseases, how you treat diseases, various kinds of horses and whatnot. It's a unique manuscript. We had it on exhibit in 1970 when we had this large exhibition at UCLA. I was reminded of that because at the end of the manuscript, which I have seen and had a microfilm made of, it says specifically that the work was translated from a considerable number of Arabic and Indian manuscripts dealing with the subject of horses. Now, a certain number of Arabic words came into Armenian through Persian because Persia was under the domination, came under the domination of the Arabs simultaneously, shortly before Armenia came under Arab domination. And the Arabic language had a vastly more significant impact on the Persian language than it did on the Armenian, and some 700 words that are of Arabic origin did not come into Armenian directly from Arabic or speakers of Arabic who were in occupation of Armenia, but they came into the Armenian vocabulary through Persian. How can we tell this? Because the forms in which they have been preserved in Armenian are similar to the forms as they exist in Persian and not in Arabic literature. Now, during the past 9 centuries, perhaps one might say that the greatest influence on Armenian, and here we're talking about one segment of the Armenian population rather than the other, so the so-called Turkish Armenians or Western Armenians. The greatest influence was from the Turkish language. Now this is explained by the fact that Armenia was ruled successively by the Seljuk Turks beginning in the last quarter of the 11th century and later by the Ottoman Turks. But it's interesting to note that in contrast to the other foreign languages that have influenced the Armenian vocabulary, the influence of Turkish was not on literary Armenian, but rather it was confined to certain local spoken dialect of Armenian. As a matter of fact, there came a time that the vast majority of Armenians living in Asia Minor gradually became Turkish-speaking. Most of the Greeks, most of the Armenians, most of the Jews, your ancestors, they all gradually became Turkish-speaking. But as I mentioned a moment ago, it is extremely significant to note that the influence of Turkish was not on the Armenian literary language, but the spoken dialects. Dr Sanjian has studied the Armenian language that was spoken in the capital of Istanbul before the First World War, and he came to the conclusion that there were some 4,000 Turkish words that the Armenians used when they spoke Armenian. It's like many Armenians in this country who speak Armenian, and although the grammar and syntax, the articles and the particles are all Armenian, frequently more than 50% of the vocabulary is English. May I cite my own favorite example? Yes, automobila hos parkenem, the street crossere, for very drugstore, Johnny telephone ere, and so what is it, Badr Chine, Badr Baller, saying that I'll park the car here. All the grammar is perfectly good Armenian. The articles, particles, etc. is perfect. But as you saw, somewhat slightly exaggerated from the example that I used, at least 90% of the vocabulary is English. Now, I think this brief summary underscores the foreign influences that contributed to the organic development of the Armenian language, which earlier I said passed through a number of stages. Now, Armenian literature began, as I said earlier, in the beginning of the 5th century AD, immediately upon the creation of the Armenian alphabet in the year 406 AD. Now, prior to the 5th century, Armenian literature was confined to what is generally known as oral literature, consisting of folk songs, legends, fables, and epic poetry, which was developed essentially by the traveling minstrels or troubadours with their musical instruments and whatnot. We know about an epic that was created by these minstrels in ancient times, in pagan times. We know about the various stories and legends created in this type of folk literature. And we also have, thanks to the first Armenian historian who attempted a comprehensive history of the Armenian people, Moses Forenatsi, a total of 141 lines of poetry. And these 141 41 lines contain a total of 183 distinct words. There's some repetition, of course. And it already shows that with these in these tiny fragments alone, there were borrowings from Persian, from Chaldean, from Georgian, from Assyrian, and one each from Syriac and Greek. So even in the first documentary evidence of the literature, there is the evidence of words which are related to other, literally neighboring languages. Now, with the creation of the Armenian alphabet in 406 AD, the foundations were laid for the inception and development of the Armenian national literature. And there are some 41 works that have survived from that initial period, which lasted from the year 406 until roughly 460 AD. And this is the period which is generally known in Armenian history, in Armenian literature, as the golden age of Armenian literature. They did not call it as such at the time. It was a designation given in more recent centuries. Now, the majority of these books that have survived are actually translations, mostly of religious, theological, liturgical nature, primarily from Greek and secondarily from Syriac. But the crowning achievement and perhaps the primary reason for the creation of the Armenian alphabet and the inception of the Armenian national literature was perhaps the desire to provide the speakers of Armenian the Bible in their own language. Now, as one who teaches advanced level modern Armenian and the classical Armenian in which the Bible was translated on all levels that I teach, I can say from personal experience that the Armenian version, is referred to it as translation, the Armenian version of the Bible, which includes both the Old and the New Testaments, is one of the masterpieces of world literature. It was the major achievement of the early part of Armenian literature. It was the most important book ever written in the Armenian language because it had the most profound impact upon the development not only of the Armenian language but on the Armenian religion, the theology, and the literature in general. And this is the language which, at its very inception, is characterized by the richness of its vocabulary, by its abundance of synonyms, its idiomatic and grammatical regularity and precision. I keep telling my students from the very beginning when they start classical Armenian with me, this is a language which uses a great deal of economy of words. There are many things that are not there, but they are there because they are implied. And that is why I refer to the grammatical regularity and the precision of expression. And unless you know the grammar very well, you think you understand the meaning of a classical text, but you don't. Now, there's a good deal of scholarly controversy about the language which was used to produce the Armenian version of the Bible, to translate the Greek and Syriac, basically religious works into Armenian. And the controversy has been going on for at least two basic reasons. Number one, how is it possible for any people who have had no literary tradition, no recorded literature, to all of a sudden create an alphabet and produce a book like the Bible with the kind of language, vocabulary, precision of expression, and extremely highly sophisticated language? How is it possible? And you don't start a language, a literary language, and produce masterpieces of great linguistic literary quality. Because from that period on, some people say there has been a decline. Now, that's not a scientific statement to make. What I want to say is that from that time on, there have been changes in the language, because language is an organic thing. And it's not fair to say what preceded was better than what succeeded, or vice versa. The other reason is that was there or was there not a literature before the year 406? It's a hotly debated issue. It has not been resolved. Whatever scholars say is pure conjecture, and I shan't go into it. I won't even do any research in that particular area. There's so many other areas to do research in to produce more fruitful results. One has to wait until documentary evidence is found, hopefully, as a result of archaeological excavations. Now, bring this to a conclusion somehow. So I will present that referring to my notes. We have seen that in the course of some 2,500 years, the Armenian language and basically its vocabulary developed as a result of not only its own organic growth, but also because of its direct and, in some instances, indirect contact with other cultures employing different languages. I also refer to the golden age of Armenian literature, the Bible, and not only the large number of translations from Greek and Syriac into Armenian, but also the creation of an original literature which included the first history, comprehensive history of the Armenian people. From that point on, we see certain historical developments. Beginning about the 6th century, a group of Armenian scholars who lived in the capital of the Byzantine Empire, namely Byzantium, or later known as Constantinople, initially known as Byzantium, but when it became the capital of the Eastern Empire, it was known as Constantinople. These people engaged in serious scholarly research. They were fundamentally interested in ancient Greek philosophy. They began the effort of translating not religious but philosophical texts of Armenian, and in the process they discovered that the Armenian language was woefully deficient in philosophical terminology. It's a long story, it lasted for about 2 centuries, but in the process, from the very beginning, because of the tremendous impact of classical Greek, these scholars essentially living and working in Islam, in Byzantium, developed an artificial language, an artificial Armenian language, which subsequently came to be known as Phil-Hellene Armenian. That is an Armenian language somewhat independent of the classical traditional Armenian language, which in many essentials was patterned after the Greek language, which meant that if you didn't know Greek, you were in trouble. And since many Armenians didn't know Greek, and since this was an artificial language, it lasted for about 2 centuries and eventually disappeared. Whereas the basic traditional classical language, which is generally referred to as Grapa, continued and did continue until about the middle of the 19th century, believe it or not, as the proper medium of literary expression. In the 13th century or so, as a result of the very concerted efforts of Catholic missionaries in the East, who worked among the Christian people essentially in an effort to proselytize them into Catholicism, many Catholic religious, theological, ritualistic books were translated into Armenian, but they utilized a language which sounded more Latin than Armenian. And this language is referred to as Phil-Latin because the Armenian that they developed, and in which they essentially translated many of these Catholic books, was more Latin than Armenian. And since this too was an artificial language, it did not survive beyond the 16th century. And ironically, the death blow given to this language was essentially an Armenian Catholic institution based in Venice. That is to a large extent responsible for the extinction of that artificial Latin language. Jumping over the many centuries, in the Middle Ages, with Armenia having lost its political independence as a result of the onslaught of the Seljuk Turks and the creation of an Armenian state in the eastern corner of the Mediterranean, which is known as Cilicia, there developed an official language which was based on the spoken language, but it was used as the official language of the government, and it occupies a medial position between the old classical and the modern language, and therefore it's referred to as Middle Armenian. What it means is that this language, which was used for about 3 or 4 centuries, had basic elements of the classical language, but it had also developed, it had also elements from the spoken vernacular, which eventually became the basis of modern Armenian. Once again, jumping over a large period, we come to modern times. In the beginning of the 19th century, people came to realize that literature had, for all intents and purposes, not only begun as the domain of the clergy, but also the preserve of the clergy from the very beginnings until that point in time, namely the beginning of the 19th century. And since the church has always been conservative and traditionalist, it clung on to the language That was the basis of the literature, the theology, the doctrine, and everything else. And since the spoken language had changed so much that the two were not on speaking terms, so to speak, the speakers of the language didn't understand the literature, like speakers of Italian not understanding Latin. And therefore something had to be done about this. Well, a struggle began between two groups of individuals. The conservatives, and I'm not using this in a political sense, and the so-called liberals. The conservatives advocating the continued use of what was the church language, for all intents and purposes a dead language if it was not spoken, and the liberals advocated the development of a modern Armenian language based on some dialect that could be understood by the people who use it. It is one of the most fascinating developments in any kind of national tradition, I would say, in that this controversy, the conflict, was waged in the Armenian press. Journals of one kind or another began to mushroom, and the controversy was debated in the press. In the process of debating the issues and the controversy, they were also developing the modern language. And there are so many fascinating stories. You'd say one of the things they did was that they said, opponents of the modern, they said we ought to get rid of there were two independent developments. There was the movement going on in the Caucasus mountainous area, and the other in Istanbul. The ones in Istanbul, the liberals said we ought to get rid of all the foreign words in Armenian. By foreign words, at that time, they understood all the Turkish words used in the spoken vernacular, and there were some 4,000 of them. They also meant some Italian words, lingua franca type of words that are used by Turks, by Greeks, by Armenians, by all the various ethnic groups in the area. So you eliminate 4,000 or 5,000 words from the spoken language, and you're left with very little. So what do? They said, okay, we're eliminating all of these Turkish words. Let's go back to the dictionary of classical Armenian and revive several thousand dead words. That is why today, in the modern language, there are so many words which are the same as those used in classical Armenian. Some, however, have changed their meaning, and therefore anyone who knows modern Armenian and is studying classical or Kyrgyz Armenian must be on his guard, because he cannot assume that the word he read has the same meaning in modern Armenian as it did in classical Armenian. So this, and therefore, as a result of this linguistic conflict that went on for about half a century, from the beginning of the 19th until about the middle of the 19th century, the liberals naturally won. And we have the Western dialect of Armenian, and also, independently of this, the Eastern dialect of Armenian, which was developed during the time of the Tsarist rule in the Caucasus, in the Caucasian Armenian. And one would say that these are explained in terms of the political realities. One segment was under Persian rule, the other under Russian rule, and the other under Turkish rule. do they understand one another? Those who speak the East dialect and those who speak the West dialect? Of course they do. There's a good deal of, number one, it's the same basic language. The vocabulary is basically the same. There are phonological differences. We pronounce some of the consonants differently than they do. There are some grammatical differences, but they are mutually intelligible. And on this note, I should conclude by saying that since the development of the modern language, which goes back to the middle of the 19th century, and not only there has been tremendous growth of Armenian literature in many, many areas, but also a tremendous shift from what used to be the religious basis of Armenian culture and literature to a very largely secularist tradition. And that is the period we're in now. Thank you very much.
Are there any questions? Marilyn?
Dr. Sanjian, you mentioned that a German linguist.
What?
You mentioned that a German linguist had determined about a century ago that Armenian was not just a branch of Persian, but a language of its own right. I can catch his name.
Hubschmann.
Hubschmann.
Virginia?
I don't know the second one. The question is, were there any other Armenian linguists who have compiled dictionaries of Armenian? The answer to that is definitely yes. But what I said in connection with Ajarian was that he was the first and to this day the only linguist, Armenian or non-Armenian, who has compiled this etymological dictionary. Now there are many other dictionaries. There's a huge dictionary of classical Armenian. That's not etymological. It doesn't give the history of each word. And there are many, many excellent dictionaries of the classical language. And dictionaries of modern Armenian are absolutely horrible.
You mentioned the Syriac language. Is that the same as the Aramaic?
Syriac is very closely related to Aramaic, yes. They are Semitic languages. And Hebrew, Arabic, so on. Armenian is not related to that group of languages. There are a few borrowings, but basically they're different languages.
Are there any other questions?
The last part you mentioned the conflict between the Caucasus and the Istanbul and Armenian and also, which ones were in favor of keeping the classical Armenian as it was?
The conflict was not between the Armenians in the Caucasus and the Armenians in Istanbul. The conflict was among conservatives and liberals, proponents of the classical as opposed to those who advocated the creation and use of a modern language. In each of these two places, the conflict in each group, there were conservatives and liberals in Istanbul, conservatives and liberals so-called in the Caucasus and Moscow. Leaders in Moscow had a very important role in that.
How was this conflict go about? I mean, no, what was the result of this conflict? Because modern Armenian is now the most used.